So after Congress passed the Impoundment Control Act in 1974, for the rest of the 70s, the presidents Ford and Carter would request some rescissions, some that the Congress would accept, and some they wouldn't. The president proposes, Congress disposes. That's how it's supposed to be. And then Reagan was the rescissions king. He requested rescissions like crazy. He wanted the government to stop doing things that he didn't think it should be doing, and so he was aggressive. He requested all kinds of rescissions. 101 requests in 1981, which saved about $11 billion. And then 245 proposed rescissions in fiscal year 1985. And then President George H.W. Bush requested a bunch of them as well. And that was actually the first time in 1992 where the specified processes in the Impoundment Control Act were actually kind of used. Congress subbed in some of its own rescissions, but also sort of more or less used the process in the Senate.
Americans are capable of achieving extraordinary things when they have the freedom and opportunity to do so. This is American Potential.
Hey everyone, welcome to the American Potential Podcast. I'm your host, David Fromm. Be honest, how excited do you get when you hear that Congress is cutting federal spending? Probably not very, unless you're a nerd like some of us. Out of all the things in the world to get excited about, spending cuts are not exactly thrilling, but they do have a real impact. You might have heard about a recent $9.4 billion rescission package that Congress passed. What it did was pull funding from a bunch of programs like the U.S. Agency for International Development, or USAID, and the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. So here's a question. If the money was already approved, how can they take it back? To answer that, we need to go back to the era of presidential impoundments, when presidents, most notably Richard Nixon, began withholding funds that Congress had already approved. That power struggle between the White House and Capitol Hill led to the Impoundment Control Act of 1974, a law that changed how budget politics work in Washington. Today, we'll break down what rescissions are, how they work, and what other rescission packages could be coming. I want to welcome back to the podcast our guest, Kurt Couchman, who is a senior policy fellow for Americans for Prosperity. Kurt, welcome back.
Hey, David. Thanks for having me on.
Well, we're excited for this topic, man. Whenever I kind of joke that it's not that much fun to talk about federal spending cuts, but when there haven't been spending cuts in so long and the opposite has been true, like the growth of spending, it actually really is exciting, no matter how small or big that those cuts are. So I actually kind of am a little excited to talk about this.
I'm always excited when we're bringing the federal government back towards its constitutionally limited government role.
Yep, exactly, man. So, hey, well, just talk to us and walk us through how the rescission process works.
Sure. First of all, what are rescissions? It's not a recession, which is when the economy is shrinking. It's more like scissors. Rescission, scissors, similar root word, right? And the idea is that you cancel appropriations that Congress has already made under the Constitution. Congress has the power to appropriate. And what that means is that Congress is giving federal agencies what's called budget authority or contract authority, the authority to go out and spend money. And so when they go out and they work with vendors and contractors to sign contracts, that's when money becomes obligated. There's a legal commitment to spend the money. And then when the money actually goes out the door to the non-federal entity, then that's when the outlays happen. But when Congress is rescinding money, they're canceling some of that budget authority that hasn't been committed yet. And the other piece of it is that the administration can cancel contracts when there's a malfeasance or if they don't think the contract would actually fulfill the goal. So that's part of the equation as well. Now, normally rescissions are carried in other legislation, continuing resolutions or fresh appropriations bills, supplemental appropriations, all that kind of thing. And that is the normal way that rescissions happen. It's just in the course of business, Congress realizes the money doesn't need to go out and it can either be canceled entirely or canceled and then reappropriated for another purpose. But then there's a special process in the Congressional Budget and Impoundment Control Act of 1974. It's relatively rare that it's been used. What happens is that the president requests the Congress cancel a certain amount of funds from specified accounts. And then Congress has 45 days to consider that. If Congress doesn't approve it, then the money has to be spent. But as you talked about in the introduction, that was really part of an attempt to shift the power of the purse back to Congress after President Nixon refused to spend about a third of non-defense spending that Congress had appropriated in 1973. So Congress wanted to take the power back. Nixon, of course, was on his back feet or on his heels
Yeah.
in 1974.
The president can request this. What if the Congress decides not to do anything with it?
Yeah, so normally what happens, the president has to spend the money after 45 days. But then there's this new thing that we've never seen used before called pocket rescissions. The director of the Office of Management and Budget, Russ Vought, has been talking about this even before he was in this position. And so, again, with the Impoundment Control Act, Congress has to affirmatively approve the cuts within 45 days or the executive branch has to spend it. But if you do that within 45 days of when the funds are expiring at the end of the fiscal year, then the theory goes that the funds will expire before the 45-day window is up. And so you can actually cancel spending in this way. Now, this is an attempt, we expect, for them to put the issue before the Supreme Court. There's an attempt to declare the Impoundment Control Act unconstitutional. The Center for Renewing America, which Russ Vought ran before he was back in the Trump administration, wrote about this. Now, that's not our POV. I mean, we think that the ICA is too restrictive prudentially, but still well within the boundaries of Congress's power to enact implementing legislation for its appropriations power. So we may see that fight play out in the next couple of months.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's been really interesting, I think, over the last, I don't know, just number of years, all across Congress and government, really, in public policy. We've seen so many examples of like a pull and tug of like the proper role of Congress and the proper role of agencies or the executive branch. It's just been a reoccurring theme I've noticed as we've done shows here.
Mhm.
So often that's been one of the conversations. I'm actually thrilled that we're having these conversations because they're being forced by the courts, really by legislators, but also cases going before the Supreme Court, where we're really trying to right-size government or get it back to where it should be constitutionally. Do you see this as one of those kind of conversations?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the first sentence of the Constitution is all legislative powers here and granted shall be vested in the Congress of the United States. I've got my little battered pocket Constitution that I use a lot. But like, that's the thing. Congress is supposed to be making the laws. You know, we had that huge victory in the Loper Bright decision last year, reversing the Chevron deference doctrine. And now the ball really is in Congress's court of like, how do you actually vindicate the powers that in the Constitution you have, but how do you actually make them real and take back the power that has been given inappropriately to the executive branch or that the executive branch has just sort of claimed and Congress hasn't been able to push back?
So going back to rescissions, are there examples of some rescission bills that have passed? And conversely, are there some examples of rescissions that previous presidents have proposed but Congress didn't take up?
Oh, yeah. In the beginning, so after Congress passed the Impoundment Control Act in 1974, for the rest of the 70s, the presidents Ford and Carter would request some rescission, some the Congress would accept, and some they wouldn't. The president proposes, Congress disposes. That's how it's supposed to be. And then Reagan was the rescissions king. I mean, he
Really?
requested rescissions like crazy. I mean, he wanted the government to stop doing things that he didn't think it should be doing, and so
Yeah.
he was aggressive. He requested all kinds of rescissions. 101 requests in 1981, which saved about $11 billion. And then 245 proposed rescissions in fiscal year 1985. And then President George H.W. Bush requested a bunch of them as well. And that was actually the first time in 1992 where the specified processes in the Impoundment Control Act were actually kind of used. Congress subbed in some of its own rescissions, but also sort of more or less used the process in the Senate. There are a number of instances where a president has said, hey, let's not spend the money. And Congress is like, no, we're spending the money. And, that's okay. Legislative powers and all that. But there were no rescissions requests whatsoever from Presidents George W. Bush, President Obama, or President Biden. So Trump is the last one, or the only one to have done it since the turn of the century. And as far as I can tell, it's the first time that this process has been used entirely within the bounds of the ICA and successfully. Well, yeah. So we're marking new milestones here.
Yeah, that's exciting. I didn't realize it had been used so frequently by Reagan and even H.W. Bush, because in my time working in public policy and politics, it seemed like a new process to me. It's not a
Well,
new
that's
process.
because, yeah, normally it's just the Congress receives the request from the president and then just tucks it into other legislation that passes with 60 votes in the Senate. And what's different about the Impoundment Control Act process is we talked about the president requests, Congress has 45 days, but the other piece of it is that it's not subject to the filibuster in the Senate. So it's a
Oh,
simple majority in the House, simple majority in the Senate. And that certainly rubbed some appropriators the wrong way. We saw Senator Collins voting against it for that reason. And then all the Democrats, of course, voted against it. So it did pass with basically a bare majority in the Senate as well. So we could continue doing this, or we could go back to doing it in appropriations, but we've got to have a system that actually works for that to be reliable, right?
yeah. Yeah. Well, those appropriators do love to appropriate. So a lot of
Self-selected
times.
onto the committee.
Exactly. Well,
Yep.
so I mentioned in the intro a few examples. You got USAID and public broadcasting, some of the cuts, but are there other examples of what was included in the rescissions bill that President Trump sent?
Yeah, one thing that fell out of the bill was a $400 billion in rescissions for global health programs, because there are a number of senators who are concerned about a program called PEPFAR. It's the President's Emergency Program for AIDS Relief. So that
Yeah.
wasn't that fell out between the request and the actual bill, but there are $9 billion in savings right now, which if you extend over the traditional 10-year budget window, that's like $100 billion of savings if the savings stick. So hopefully they will. One of those big savers was the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, which subsidizes, government-produced media. No role for that, and so that was a little over $1 billion. But what was interesting about that, it was a pre-funding, so it hasn't actually cut any spending yet. It cut the spending that was pre-appropriated for fiscal year 2026, which starts October 1st, and for FY 2027. There was duplicative stuff. There was an account in there, multilateral assistance, funds appropriated to the president, international organizations and programs. So totally wiped out. The budget authority for this, $437 million rescinded. But that really overlaps with a different account, international organizations, contributions to international organizations. And so, like, that only got an 11% cut out of $1.5 billion. And of course, this administration is more skeptical of some of these programs than the previous one was. There's some actively harmful stuff that got cut. The contribution to the Clean Technology Fund, basically to subsidize all the green energy stuff around the world. So $125 million cancel there. That's just, this funding runs through non-governmental organizations, many of which have questionable ideological perspectives on the world.
Yep.
There's some outdated accounts. There were two post-Cold War transition accounts. I mean, it's been 34 years since the Cold War ended. So, like, maybe it's time to not be so focused on transition initiatives and aid to former Soviet countries.
What do you think? You're a guy who, me knowing you and like your professional life, like you're a guy who's thought deeply about how the federal government, especially Congress, can do a better job of spending and making budgets. So for this process, is there a way to make it work better?
Yeah, I mean, we get a win every so often in this process. I mean, the One Big Beautiful Bill Act to extend the taxes and keep tax hikes from going up on Americans, to move resources away from like the crazy non-performing green energy stuff to reliable energy, and then some healthcare things, some good government, waste, fraud, and abuse stuff. So that was a big win. This rescissions bill, that was a win as well, but it's not really enough to get the federal government back on track. We haven't actually passed, or Congress, sorry, we used to work for members of Congress, so I still do the we
Yep.
sometimes.
Same.
But Congress hasn't actually passed all of the appropriations bills by the start of the new fiscal year since 1996. For fiscal year 1997, they're usually 5 minutes late on average, and but that's only a quarter of spending. and none of the revenue in the appropriations bill. So Congress really does need a new regular order that works. There's great legislation that Blake Moore from Utah, a member of the House, has put forward called the Comprehensive Congressional Budget Act.
Mm-hmm.
And that would put the appropriations bills in the proper context, which is with all of the rest of the spending and with all of the revenue, including spending through the tax code, so that members of Congress can see the whole picture and say, hey, can we do better than this? And the truth is, yes. I mean, appropriations are fairly well picked over, at least for the coalition that typically supports them, which does lean more towards the Democrats right now. But we've got massive amounts of waste in healthcare entitlement programs, in the tax code. And so that can all be cleaned up for both a leaner, more efficient government, but also for deficit reduction and spending reduction and control in the debt. So we do need that. And then, I mentioned before that the Impoundment Control Act maybe goes a little too far in terms of its prudential, because it really does require the administration to spend virtually all of the funds that Congress has appropriated, which is not something that most states do. There's a handful that are kind of along those lines, but most of them say explicitly, like, if you don't need it, send it back to the general fund or maybe let it roll over a little bit. Depends on the state. But if we had a federal budget process where Congress could really drive policy, then they might be a little more comfortable with sort of the give and take, that they could allow the agencies to not spend all the dollars. But also, like, if it made sense to rescind money, then you'd have a more timely opportunity to take that money back, maybe use it for other purposes, maybe not spend it at all, depending on what Congress wants to do. But they need to have a process that works before that's going to be something that they can do.
So, bottom line, the good news here is that Congress is cutting federal spending.
Absolutely.
And I know that we would love to see a lot more. Well, let me ask you a different question. Are there other areas that you see rescission packages coming forward to deal with?
Yeah, I mean, Russ Vogt, the director of OMB, has talked about how there are more rescissions requests that they'd like to send along. We mentioned the pocket rescissions before. We're expecting that sometime toward the end of August or September, within that 45-day window before the end of the fiscal year, there'll be additional rescissions requests. And if Congress does not act on those, and it's kind of tough to imagine that happening. The appropriators are getting increasingly antsy about not getting their bills done, and that sort of trickles down to a bunch of other things. Then, yeah, we could see a big constitutional clash. I won't call it a crisis. It's more of a clash, the separation of powers and vindicating them and all of that. So we could see more rescissions requests kind of leading into that sort of thing. And, we would support 90-something% of the spending cuts that would be coming over from OMB, maybe 100% even. It's just that Congress, under our Constitution, has the power to appropriate, to deappropriate, to do revenue, maybe even to do tariff policy. I don't know, throwing that out there.
Well, look, I think the bottom line, as I started to say before, is the federal government's trying to cut spending and is actually cutting spending. Hopefully, I know that we'd love to see a lot more. So that's exciting that maybe this is the beginning of the process. So just maybe at the end of the day, why is cutting these funds helpful to the American taxpayer?
Yeah, a lot of the spending is at least wasteful. And so you're talking about taking money either from current taxpayers or from future generations to spend on stuff that isn't worth doing. Like, who would do that? That just doesn't make sense. Sometimes what they're spending money on is actively harmful to Americans or to people abroad. There's a long litany of the failures of our foreign aid programs to actually, help countries develop. Certainly at home, we have a number of programs that aren't delivering, that are actually trapping people in dependence and keep making it harder for them to be contributors to the communities they live in. So that's not good. But from a macro perspective, when spending is greater than revenue, it requires borrowing. That means more debt. The high debt burden that we have right now, and it's growing, hurts prosperity, partly by just taking funds that should be used for investments in productive activities that make us, more productive and more prosperous, and lifts our standard of living. But it also creates uncertainty. Because people don't know at the end of the day how Congress and the federal government are going to resolve these imbalances, and that suppresses the investment that we need. We saw inflation when the Biden administration went gangbusters with the American Rescue Plan Act. We immediately had inflation take off after that. Now, there had been pressure building up, but that was the straw that broke the camel's back, and I wrote a paper about that last year. And the further we go, the higher the debt burden gets, the greater the risk is for a debt crisis. And that would just be devastating to our prosperity. It would undermine the foundations of our entire financial system, the payment system. People's paychecks could come not on time, be significantly delayed. And then the political impact of that, like if we were in a crisis, we would probably have massive tax increases all of a sudden. That'd be terrible, obviously. And then from a security perspective, like we have 220 something thousand troops permanently stationed all around the world. Now, there's a case for reevaluating that, bringing a lot of our troops home, but you want to do it in a phased, expected, gradual way. You don't want to just yank it all out, or you can end up having security vacuums. So that is one of the big risks from a debt crisis as well. So, there's all these practical issues about overspending and why we need to cut spending. But there's just kind of the intuition as well that stealing from the future and undermining future prosperity is just wrong. It's the wrong thing to do to our kids and someday our grandkids, depending on, how old we might be.
Yeah, and yet politicians for the last number of decades have done exactly that, stole from the future and just kept spending because they've lacked the will. So I'm pretty happy to hear about these rescission packages and interested to see how they continue to develop.
But
Kurt,
the deficits we've been seeing, a lot of that, and a lot of the dysfunction is a symptom of a bad underlying budget process and Congress not being able to assert itself. So once we fix that, then all this stuff should get better.
well, hey, you actually have some exciting news yourself. So what is that news? So you maybe share with everybody that's listening.
Sure, yeah, happy to share. So I have a book about getting the federal government's budget back on track. It's mostly framed around a balanced budget amendment to the Constitution, why we need one, why prior efforts have fallen short, how it could actually succeed next time, and the statutory pieces needed to make it all work. The book is called Fiscal Democracy in America: How a Balanced Budget Amendment Can Restore Sound Governance. And so the ebook is already available. The print version should be out later this month, and just really excited to be able to put that out in the world.
Well, that's great. Like I said, Kurt, I've been watching it, obviously part of the same organization, and you've been a thought leader in this area, and it's only appropriate that you're putting a book out on it now to kind of keep getting those great ideas out there that, man, if the federal government could adopt, and even I know a number of the ones that you've been talking about with state governments even, we'd be showing a lot more respect to the taxpayers by not taking their money and wasting it. Like unfortunately has been happening for decades here. So I'm so glad you're putting that out there. And I'm really glad that you're able to come on the show and share a lot of this great knowledge with us.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm glad to share this time with you and share these ideas with our listeners. So, and members of Congress are getting excited about this stuff as well. Partly because it would make their job better, and they'd be able to solve more problems for the American people. So, very excited about what's to come. Thanks for having me, David.
Thanks, Kurt. Folks, if you like this episode and would like to stay connected with the podcast, be sure to like and subscribe to our channel, as well as following us on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. And always remember, liberty and freedom are easily taken for granted. Don't take it for granted. Go out there and defend freedom and liberty. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you on the next episode.
Thank you for listening to American Potential. You may listen to more stories from Americans working every day to expand freedom and opportunity in their communities by visiting AmericanPotential.com.